thank you. What a delight to see so many people here today. I'm Don Kulik, and I'm going to speak to you about language, but I want to begin with an apology. I don't speak your language. I'm very sorry about that. I lament that, but I know that with the help of the very competent people here at Ishi TV, I hope we'll be able to communicate. I'm an anthropologist, and I have spent the better part of my life studying how a language dies. This question has become more urgent in recent years because linguists have determined that about 90% of the world's languages are endangered. That is to say, they may die within the next 100 years. Now, the language that I study is one of these languages, and it's spoken in a country called Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea is the place where there are more languages spoken than anywhere else in the world. In the video you just saw, I said there's about 1,000 languages spoken there, and linguists still don't know how many languages are spoken, but we know it's a lot. It's at least 13% of the entire number of languages spoken in the world. I should also say that it's not a big country. It's the size of the Chinese province of Sichuan, and there are 8 million people who live there. So we're talking a lot of little languages. Now, when I decided to go to Papua New Guinea, I didn't know much about Papua New Guinea. So I went to Australia, and I sought out the help of an Australian linguist whose name is Don Laycock. And Don Laycock had spent many decades in Papua New Guinea. And so I went to him and I say, I'm interested in language death, where should I go? And he said, I know of a village, I've heard about a quite remote village where people say they speak a language unlike any other. I've never been there, but it's a small village, so why don't you go and see what might be happening? So I did. I found my way to Gapun, which the village was called. It wasn't easy. There are no roads in the area, and the fastest way to get there is from the nearest town, go on a truck for 9 hours on an unpaved road, get into a canoe with a motor on the back, go by sea for 2 hours, go into a mangrove swamp for another hour, a creek for another hour, they get out of the canoe and walk through the rainforest for another hour. It's a very remote place. When I came to the village, I was about the 7th white person to ever come there at all. And as you can imagine, I created a sensation. They came to look at me, and they wanted to know why I was there. The men who brought me said to them that I wanted to write a book about their language. That was very mysterious for them. About the only book they had ever seen was a Christian Bible that they had seen a priest carry when the priest occasionally, once a year, would come into the village. So the villagers really wondered, who was I, really? I wasn't a priest. I told them that I wasn't a priest. So who was I? It took them about 3 weeks to come to a conclusion. And the conclusion was that I was a ghost. I was a dead villager who, they knew exactly who I was. I was a baby. I had died as a baby, so I didn't speak Tayap. I was too early, but I had come back to the village. And there's me looking, I think, very much like a ghost. You know, I've heard people say I look Asian, too, in this picture, so maybe I'm an Asian ghost. But this was me. They told me that I was a dead villager, and the time they told me this was, it was the worst possible time to tell me this. There was a thunderstorm going on. It was the middle of the night. There was lightning. There was thunder. Think of all of the horror movies you've ever seen. And then in the middle of that scene, villagers are sitting saying, "You're dead. You're a ghost." So that was quite sober, and I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do? I thought, what do they want from a ghost? It was very unsettling. But I came to realize gradually that me being a ghost, me being a villager, albeit in a very different form, it made them very hospitable. It made them very generous. And they've been extraordinarily generous to me for the past 35 years when I've been coming and going back to the village. Linguistic situation in the village was interesting. The language, it turns out, is called Tayap. Tayap, when I came to the village in 1985, was spoken by 90 people out of a total village population of 130. Today it's spoken by about 40 people. So it's a very small language, but this is not unusual in Papua New Guinea. Linguists estimate that about 35% of the languages in the country are only spoken by about 500 people. As Don Laycock suspected, it is an isolate language. It's not related to any other language, but of course it's a fully formed language. It's just as much of a language as Chinese is, as Japanese is, as English is, which means it's been developing for hundreds and maybe even thousands of years. Now, what I discovered very quickly is that children under 10 didn't speak it. They didn't speak Tayap. They spoke a language called Tok Pisin, which I'm going to tell you a bit more about in a second, but they were not speaking their ancestral language. So for the first time in the history of the village, they weren't speaking the language that they always had learned. What I was witnessing was the beginning of a language shift. Now, people have written books about language death, but when they've written books about language death, they tend to look at the oldest speakers. They'll look at a language that only has 5 or 10 speakers left. That's the language is dying. They'll talk to those speakers, they'll salvage what they can from the language that is dying, and that in fact does die when the speakers die. I was seeing the beginning of that process, how it starts, not how it ends, how it starts. In order to do that, I had to stay in the village. But this is the house they built me in 1985. It's a wonderful house. I stayed there for 15 months, and I realized that in order to understand how Tayap was not being passed on to children, I had to learn Tayap. I had many teachers in the village who taught me, but my main language teacher was an old man named Raya. He had chronic tuberculosis, which means that he basically looked like a skeleton. You could see every bone in his body. He coughed continually. He was curmudgeonly, he was mean, he didn't like anyone. I was afraid of him. He reminded me of a raptor. You know, he had a big nose and he just was mean. But I went to him. He was one of the oldest men, and I kind of went up to him and I said, "Could you please help me with this language?" And I, of course, was speaking Tok Pisin, which is the language all of the kids are changing to, are learning now. So I said to him in Tok Pisin, "Can you please just help me with the language?" And he agreed. He agreed. I don't, unfortunately, have any images of Raya. Most of my photographs from the 1980s were lost, and I didn't have any video equipment with me then. But this is Sopak, and this is just going to give you a sense of what the language sounds like. I think it's always nice to have an idea.
Kutami banang kengiwok mabgi babaran. Nje sasik toton. Asendam de kanda madide. Digi sasik wen perkrewoke monga kanga nurke.
And you'll notice that Sopak, her mouth is completely red. I don't know how many of you know about betel nut. People in the village chew it continually, and it turns your mouth red. It turns your teeth black as well, but that's attractive, so that's not a problem. One of the things that Raya helped me to understand is how the language that the kids were learning, Tok Pisin, how it came into the village. And it turned out that at the beginning of the 1900s, white people appeared, white colonialists appeared in the area of Papua New Guinea where the villagers live. So they were German labor recruiters, and they were gathering men from the area to ship them off to a faraway island to work on a coconut plantation. Now, most people who saw these men were afraid of them. They were terrified of them. They had never seen white people before. But 2 men from Gapun, Waiki and Ayarpa, who was Raya's father, they wanted an adventure. So they sought out the white men. The villagers said, "No, don't go. They're going to eat you. They're going to kill you." They said, "We're going to go. We're going to have an adventure." They went, and they were shipped off to a plantation. The villagers thought that they had been killed, but they came back 3 years later, and they came back with treasures. They had steel knives. They had machetes. They had axes. They had bolts of factory-made cloth. They had European tobacco, none of which villagers knew anything about. But more than that, and much more long-lasting than that, they had a new language. They had a new language, and that language was called Tok Pisin. Tok Pisin today is one of the official languages of Papua New Guinea. It began as a language in the mid-1800s. And the way it developed was that European colonialists took Papua New Guineans, put them on a plantation. These men didn't speak each other's languages. They had no way of communicating with each other. They also didn't speak the European language, of course. So what did they do? They invented a language. A lot of the words of that language are taken from the European languages, German and English especially. So a word like tok means talk. A word like sanap means stand up. And here we get the colonial dimensions of the language, because what is the word for white woman? Misis. Misis. And what is the word for white man? Masta. So you see that this is a language that developed in a colonial context. But the grammar of the language is not European. It's from the languages spoken around that the men developed. Now, Ayarpa and Waiki assumed that Tok Pisin was the language of white people, because that's how they got it. They acquired it from hearing white men give them orders to do things, to work. In fact, many white people in Papua New Guinea didn't speak Tok Pisin, but they didn't know that, because the only encounter that they had with white people, those white men were speaking Tok Pisin. So when they came back to the village, they wanted to teach the language to the guys in the village, because they had such an amazing adventure that they wanted their fellow villagers to go off and have the same adventure. So they taught it to them. But they said to them, "We've taught you some of it, but you don't know it well. Go off on a plantation, learn the language, and come back." So a pattern of acquiring Tok Pisin was established. So village men would go off to the plantation, learn it, come back, and teach it to younger men. That's how the language became established in the village. After World War II, it got established even more because Christianity entered the village. In 1948, a Catholic priest came to Gapun and started baptizing people. He didn't stay very long. Nobody ever stayed very long in Gapun because there's a lot of mosquitoes and it's not a very pleasant place to stay. So people would come and go. But he came, he baptized people, he converted people to Christianity, and then he would come back about once every year. He prayed in Tok Pisin, he gave them literature in Tok Pisin, he taught them hymns in Tok Pisin. Tok Pisin spread in the village, and women also began to speak it, and that is important. Women began to speak it. By the time I was there in the 1980s, everybody was speaking both Tok Pisin and Tayap, and they switched continually. It was a continual switching between Tayap and Tok Pisin. And I said to them, "Why do you guys switch so much? Why do you switch your languages?" And they answered very simply. They said, "If Tok Pisin comes to your mouth, you use Tok Pisin. If Tayap comes to your mouth, you use Tayap." Okay. But what I noticed is that the kids weren't using Tayap. They were only speaking Tok Pisin. And I thought to myself, well, wait a minute, Tok Pisin and Tayap are being used, everyone speaks both of them. So why are the kids not learning the ancestral language? Why are the kids growing up to be monolingual? And the reason for that is culture. The reason for that is the way that the people in Gapun see themselves today in relation to the world, and how those identities, how those self-conceptions are expressed through language. Because imagine, you're a villager in Papua New Guinea, suddenly white people come. White people have things you couldn't even imagine. They had steel tools, they had axes, they had engines, they had guns. What were these things? Where did they get them from, is the question you're asking yourself. People in Papua New Guinea concluded that white people had access to a stronger God than they did. They, of course, had their own religion. They had ancestors in the rainforest who they could pray to help them hunt food, to help them grow crops, to help them make people well when they were sick. But these ancestors didn't give them any guns. They didn't give them any engines or outboard motors. We want to go to the God that gives us stuff. So that's what they did. They converted without any hesitation. They think that when Papua New Guineans die, they become white, and they go to Rome, which is in heaven, which is where God lives together with Jesus. This was a pamphlet given by a missionary. It was in the village when I was there in 1985. You see that there's two people with black hair. They're obviously Papua New Guineans. So their black hair signifies the color of their skin. The man lying down is dead. He's got a book on his chest, which is obviously the Bible, because there are no other books in any village. There's an angel standing beside them. That angel has white hair, also white skin. Now look at the rising spirit. The man has died. He's a good Papua New Guinean. He reads his Bible. Look at the color of his hair. That means the color of his skin. So his skin has changed white. And this is what Papua New Guineans believe. Or not all Papua New Guineans, but certainly people in Gapun, they believe that this is what happens when they die. Now, Tok Pisin, you'll remember, is the language of white people. Tok Pisin is the language of cargo. Tok Pisin is the language of goods. It's also the language of heaven. What Gapuners believe is that when they die, they go to heaven, they get a job, they speak Tok Pisin, and they have access to all of the things that white people have. So in that sense, Tok Pisin is desirable. We want Tok Pisin because it brings us closer to God, and it brings us most of all closer to the things that we really want. So that is the reason why language shift has happened. But the question is how? How does that happen? Because you can imagine that people have ideas about the world. Adults have a lot of ideas about the world. But how do those ideas get translated to babies in a way that affects their language? And here is where we want to think about what people think about babies. Think about what are the first words that a baby utters. Now, I know that in Chinese, it's very common for people to say that a baby's first words are something like mama or baba. In Gapun, mama and baba don't exist. There are three words that villagers think that babies say first. The first one is oku. It means, I'm leaving. I'm leaving. That's the first word a baby says. The second word is mda, which means I'm sick of this. I'm tired of it. And the third word is ayata, which means stop it. So these are the first words that people think babies say. Now again, whether they say it or not is not the point, because babies make all kinds of sounds. Babies make every possible sound. They babble. And when adults choose out of that babbling to focus on mama, yeah, babies say that, but they also say oku. People don't hear that. What that tells us is not so much about babies. It doesn't tell us what babies say. It tells us what adults think that babies are. Mama, it's like, oh, you love me, I'm your mother. Oku, oh, you're getting out of here. Okay, I'll stand back. So what these words tell us is less about the minds of the babies, but they tell us about what parents think about babies. And a baby in Gapun is considered to come into the world in a very foul mood. They don't want to be there. They're unhappy. They're sour. In Gapun, people are imagined to consist of two dimensions. It's sort of like yin and yang. One of them is the part that they're born with. And in Tok Pisin, they call it het. It means head. It means stubbornness. It means willfulness. It means big-headedness. It means independence. It's like, I don't want anyone, I want to get out of here. That's one part of a person. The other part is what villagers call save, which means knowledge. That's the social part. That's where you respect people. It's where you give way to other people. You know who your relatives are. You know who owns things. That's social knowledge. And what children are supposed to do is, as they mature, they're supposed to suppress their head and show their knowledge. So you suppress your willful, independent stubbornness, and you're supposed to be calm and placid and social. Now, what has happened in Gapun is traditionally, of course, the way that save was displayed was by knowing things like traditional myths, traditional songs, participating in rituals. That was how people showed save. That's all been displaced. It's all gone. These days, people display save by being good Christians, by talking about development, by wanting to grow cash crops. So what has happened in the village is that save, which is good, is increasingly being expressed in Tok Pisin. And head, which is bad, is increasingly being expressed in tayap. So tayap has come to symbolize bad things. Tokpisin has come to symbolize good things. And again, this is about what people think about themselves. Nobody in the village made a decision and says, oh, tayap is bad. Tayap is bad, don't speak it. But unconsciously, that's the process that has happened. Now, how does this happen? How does that actually happen? Because, of course, even if you think that, you have to convey that to children in some way. And I noticed when I was there in 1985 that there's a very specific process. Babies in Gapun are not really spoken to. I'm not sure what it's like here in China, but I know in Europe and the United States, people speak to babies incessantly. In Gapun, people don't talk to babies. Why should they? They don't talk back. But when, especially little girls, get to be about 2 years old, they start to be ordered around. So go and get that, bring that, watch that baby, do that, do that. And what I noticed is that there was a pattern in how adults talk to children at that age. They would tell the child to do something first in tayap, this is in the 1980s, first in tayap, and then if the child didn't respond, which, you know, they're kids, they often don't respond, they ignore you. If they don't respond, then the same thing is repeated in Tokpisin. So a mother would say to a child, go fetch the knife, o ta kukue. And if the child just like didn't, you know, it's like, the mother would say, kisi knife come! More forcefully. And then the child had to do it, because if the child didn't do it, the mother would throw something at the child or threaten the child. So what that meant is that children learned to attend to the Tokpisin. The tayap they could ignore, but they learned to attend to Tokpisin. And that's how they learned to separate the languages, because they learned that whenever the parent shouts at them, that's the language they have to pay attention to, because otherwise they're going to get something thrown at them or they're going to get hit. And that's the socialization process. So that is how parents very unconsciously, completely unconsciously, socialize their children to not speak tayap. And the kids, once they started learning Tokpisin, they just started speaking it, and then the process went on from there. Now, one question that I wondered is, the kids that I worked with in the 1980s, they were 2 to 5 years old, did they learn tayap later? I thought, well, maybe they're going to learn it when they're teenagers. Maybe they're going to learn it, you know, when they get married. I don't know. They're going to learn it later. As I said, I've been going back for almost 40 years, and I can tell you that they never learned it. A few people, a few of the little kids that I worked with in the 1980s, actually, they all understand it. They all understand it, but they can't speak it. A few of them can, and a few of them can actually tell little stories in it. But they never speak it in the village, ever, ever. One woman came into my house once, and I said, can you tell me a story? She told me an absolutely fluent story, and I said, I've been in the village for 8 months. I've never heard you speak this language anywhere in the village. Why not? She said, I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed. If I speak tayap, some old person will always be on hand to say, oh, that's wrong. That's wrong. You don't speak tayap. And so she said she's ashamed. And this is the case with all of the young people who have some competence in the language. They all say that old people make fun of them. And what the old people do is they say, you never learned it, you were too big-headed as a child. You didn't learn it because you had a big head. And the kids say, well, if you'd taught it to us, we would have learned it. So this kind of mutual recrimination is what is pushing tayap even closer to the grave. Parents blame children, children blame parents. And the children who are now the ones I was looking at in the 1980s, they, of course, now are in their 30s and 40s. They have kids of their own. They don't speak tayap to their kids. So they were the last generation, or the final generation of tayap speakers. So how should we think about this? How should we think about a case like Gapun? How should we think about language shift and language death more generally? Should we care? Linguists who write about language death usually have a chapter in the book that says, yes, we should care, and they say why we should care. Linguistic diversity is better than linguistic uniformity. Language is about identity. Language expresses particular knowledge of the world. Language is people's repository of history, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all very compelling reasons. They're fantastic reasons why we should care. But They're the reasons of a professional group who have a bird's eye view, a panoramic view of the world. The people who are losing their language have a different perspective. People in Gapun, frankly, don't really care that their language is being lost. They want change, they want development. And Tok Pisin they still see it as a road to development. When it comes to things like a repository of history and all of the other things that linguists think that we should think about, what we have to realize is that like a gigantic bulldozer, the 20th century has crushed the life out of everything that the people in Gapun ever believed or accomplished. It's just erased it. Now, the people in Gapun have not been passive about this. They haven't just laid down and let themselves be bulldozed. They've actively wanted the change. They wanted priests to come into the village. They wanted development to come into the village. But the tragedy is that the change that they actually have produced has reached back in their history and erased their traditional culture, their traditional value systems, and ultimately their traditional language. The forces that flattened the culture and that broke the culture, they are not in the control of the 50 or so remaining speakers of Tayap. So I actually think that it's insensitive and even patronizing for us to say, oh, it's so sad that you're losing your language. Oh, because that's in a way blaming them for the loss. They can't be blamed. They cannot be blamed for that loss. I think that rather than lament the loss of the language, which to my mind is like lamenting the loss of a bald man's comb, we should rejoice in the fact that the villagers are still there. We should be delighted at the fact that they're still there. They live, they love, they laugh, they thrive. Now, places like Gapun exist everywhere, and they're becoming more numerous for every year. I think that the least we can do is acknowledge that people like Gapun exist. We can acknowledge that there are people in faraway places in the world who have a perspective on their lives, their relationship to the world, and they have a perspective also on us, people who come and want to give them development, but don't give them development. Because at the end of the day, we should be aware that what both we and they call development, for them, often results not in development, but actually in a profound and enduring loss. Thank you.